Flashy got beastly drunk.
The Flashman series of books is probably one of my favourite series of historical novels. It's published between 1969 and 2005 and is set between 1839 and 1894. The main character of these novels is Major General Sir Harry Flashman, VC. And by chance, he's also the bully character from Thomas Hughes's book Tom Brown's School Days. The series is written by George MacDonald Fraser, and his conceit in this series is that he found bundles of papers in a tea chest at a house sale in Ashby-de-la-Zouch, and he is merely editing General Flashman's memoirs, and it comes as a little surprise to him that this great Victorian hero is also the villain of Tom Brown's School Days. The Flashman of these memoirs is a self-confessed coward, but he gains a reputation as a hero. Something he says of himself is, "Give a dog a good name." George MacDonald Fraser described Flashman as a scoundrel, a liar and a braggart. You really aren't supposed to like Flashman. He is an anti-hero, but you do end up kind of liking him throughout the series as it goes on. There are 12 books in the series, and they go from 1839, the years after he has been expelled from rugby school in Tom Brown's School Days, right up to the 1890s when he is discovered lying in a gutter by a certain Sherlock Holmes. George MacDonald Fraser gives Flashman several rather good abilities. He's a good horseman due to his training in the 4th Hussars. He's briefly in the cavalry. He also has a facility with languages which is sometimes almost supernatural, being able to pick up the rudiments of a language in a matter of days. And he's also very, very good at sex. This is, of course, one of the problems with the Flashman series from a modern standpoint. His sexual exploits, well, how do I put it? He has something of a magic penis. It's not uncommon in literature of this time, in the 60s through to the 70s and so on. He gets out of an awful lot of problems by being very good at sex. He's a compulsive womanizer. I think they estimate about 500 women succumb to his charms. Now, while he only ever admits to raping one woman, some of the seductions that he makes have a lot of no's in them until finally there is a yes, so they're a bit dodgy too. Flashman in his early days is forced into a shotgun marriage with a young girl that he seduces. In the early books, this marriage is seen as something of a joke. George MacDonald Fraser doesn't seem to have Flashman liking his wife, but after a while, their relationship sort of settles down. She shows herself to be almost as bad as Flashman in terms of her sexual proclivities, and they end up, really having a very fond and loving relationship, which is rather odd given all the difficulties in there. Now, as well as the problems with the sexual politics in this series, there is also, of course, the politics of Victorian colonialism. Flashman is an extremely cynical person. He knows exactly how bad a person he is, and he just assumes that everybody else is just as bad as him, but they, unlike him, are hypocrites. In his public life, Flashman is a hypocrite, but in his private life, the memoirs that he is writing, he is scrupulously honest, and he is as honest about himself as he is, we assume, about everything else. Flashman deals with this quite well, I think, in the book The Mountain of Light, which is all about the Second Anglo-Sikh War. A word first, though. You'll have heard it said that the British Empire was acquired in a fit of absence of mind. One of those smart, Oscarish squibs that sounds well, but is thoroughly fat-headed. Presence of mind, if you like, and countless other things, such as greed and Christianity, decency and villainy, policy and lunacy, deep design and blind chance, pride and trade, blunder and curiosity, passion, ignorance, chivalry and expediency, honest pursuit of right and determination to keep the bloody frogs out, and as often as not, Such things come tumbling together. And when the dust has settled, there we were. And who else was going to set things straight and feed the folk and guard the gate and dig the drains? Oh, aye. And make a profit by all means. I can't say I entirely agree with certainly the last part of this, but his description of all the different ways in which the British Empire was built, I think is very, very accurate and does stand the test of time. That final bit where he says, make people fed and pick up all the pieces and sort things out. Well, yeah, that doesn't ring quite so true. But the description of how the empire came about, I think, is very accurate. Now, because I want to talk about the Flashman books, and I realise that they might not be for everybody, I thought I'd invent a tag. So here's a tag: FlashmanAlternatives. The idea here is that you look at the synopsis for a Flashman novel and you come up with some alternatives which maybe tell a story that you're more happy about hearing than Flashman's daring do in the Victorian age. A long while back I put this up on my community tab on BookTube, and another bibliophile reads said that they might have a go at this, so I'm tagging another bibliophile reads for this. One of the most important things I think about George MacDonald Fraser's work in Flashman is how well he mixes Flashman into history. It's probably second to none. In fact, anybody these days weaving themselves into real life history or weaving their main characters into real life history will often be compared with George MacDonald Fraser, and often compared poorly with George MacDonald Fraser. His historical detail is extremely strong, and Flashman he appears in the right place at the right time and just fits the history that we know. So let's talk about the books. The first book, written in 1969, is called Flashman, and we are introduced to Flashy, as he likes to be called. This takes place between 1839 and 1842, and Flashman is expelled from rugby school, goes into the army, 4th Hussars, the cavalry, has a shotgun marriage, and ends up in Afghanistan as part of the ill-fated First Afghan War, where Britain is trying to control Afghanistan by putting a client king on the throne, only to find that everything goes wrong. They have to retreat from Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, and as they retreat, the entire British army and all their followers are executed. Annihilated, ambushed, murdered, everything. And Flashman is pretty much the only survivor, and he comes out a hero, even though right up until he is rescued by British soldiers, he is being a complete coward. And we see his cowardice on full display here. Alternative books here, well, obviously, if you want to know about Flashman, it's probably good to read Thomas Hughes's Tom Brown's School Days. And if you want to read about the disastrous Anglo-Afghan War in the early 1840s, then Retreat from Kabul, the First Afghan War by George Bruce, published in 1966, which means it's possible that George MacDonald Fraser might have read this before he wrote Flashman, although Flashman had been gestating for a long time. So that's quite an interesting book to read on the history of the times, and it does seem to be, from the reviews I've seen of it, it does seem to be a fairly well researched and well put together history. The next book, Royal Flash, I think George MacDonald Fraser was kind of still finding his feet with the Flashman character, and he decides to go a little bit fantastical. And Royal Flash is essentially a retelling of Anthony Hope's The Prisoner of Zenda. Prisoner of Zenda is a book where we have a look-alike character who is placed onto the throne of a small Germanic kingdom called Ruritania, and has to try to beat the bad guys who are trying to manipulate the whole situation. They've kidnapped the original king. In George MacDonald Fraser's telling of this story, Flashman does look like the Grand Duke, but it is Otto von Bismarck who is, as a young man, is using sort of Flashman's substitution into the monarchy as a test case for his empire building in Germany. Now, I wasn't able to find a decent early Bismarck biography. So I've had to pick a couple of books. One obvious one, of course, is The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. The idea is Flashman later gets very drunk and tells Anthony Hope all about it, and that's what becomes the book. And the other one is The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim, which is again about two lookalikes. It tells a story much closer to the First World War, but it is an absolutely brilliant book about lookalikes. You're never sure right up until the end exactly who has replaced who and which character you're dealing with. It's really, really well done, and it's highly recommended. The next book in the series is Flash for Freedom. This was published in 1971 and deals with the period between 1848 and 1849. It is Flashman and the Atlantic slave trade. Now in 1848, Britain had officially got rid of the slave trade and was actively trying to stop it by having patrols off the west coast of Africa and destroying slave forts and sort of disrupting everything. This did not mean that it was entirely abandoned, and in fact we see how Flashman gets kidnapped, put upon into a slave ship, sent to the kingdom of Dahomey, where he meets the Amazons. If you've seen the film The Woman King, that's the same basic people and actually the same king that's involved in this, King Gizo. From there he goes to America, where he has to act as a slave master, and he eventually escapes. He meets a young Abraham Lincoln, who is a lawyer at some point, and he tries to help a slave, although he, being Flashman, is very, very bad at it and gets people hurt. That is often the way with Flashman. An obvious book to mention, if we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade and this kind of period of time, an obvious book might be Alex Haley's Roots. Now, I've got very good reasons for not mentioning Alex Haley's Roots. I've read it. I've also read the Wikipedia article about it. Now, I would recommend you read the Wikipedia article, but probably after you've read Alex Haley's Roots rather than before. Because frankly, if you've read the Wikipedia page for Alex Haley's Roots, you won't want to read Alex Haley's Roots. It just points out too many of the factual inaccuracies and possible plagiarism in that book. So, as an alternative, I'm going to mention a couple of books which may be in some way connected with Alex Haley's Roots. One is Harold Corlander's The African, published in 1967. The other is Jubilee by Margaret Walker, published in 1966. The African is apparently very accurate for the Middle Passage when the slaves, the captive Africans were taken over the Atlantic into slavery, and Jubilee is Margaret Walker's account of life on a slave plantation from the African American point of view. Flashman at the Charge from 1973 is my favourite Flashman book. This takes place during the Crimean War, which is 1854 and 1855. Flashman is a hero and is used as a sort of dispatch rider rather than full-on part of his old regiment, which is the 4th Hussars, who form part of the Light Brigade of the Cavalry. Flashman's much more of a messenger. He also has to act as bodyguard to a relative of Prince Albert. This does not go well at all. Flashman takes part in the 3 big engagements at the Battle of Balaclava. One is the Thin Red Line, where the Highland Brigade hold back the Russian cavalry charging down and attacking them. They basically fire about 5 volleys, and the massed Russian cavalry turn tail and run. The next engagement Flashman is involved in is what's known as the Charge of the Heavy Brigade, in which the Heavy Brigade follow the Russian cavalry back up the hill while they're retreating and attack them and cause some damage to them. The Heavy Brigade are not heavy because they're well armoured. They're the Heavy Brigade because they're big lads on big horses. The Light Brigade are smaller lads on smaller horses. That's kind of the way it worked. The final engagement, of course, is perhaps the most famous engagement of the Battle of Balaclava, and that is the Charge of the Light Brigade. And of course, Flashman is in at the charge and is doing all the wrong things, but somehow surviving. Although he does get captured, and we see him in his adventures trying to escape the clutches of the Russians. If we're going to talk about the Crimean War, one of the best sources, I think, is Mary Seacole's Mrs. Seacole and in Her Adventures in Many Lands, which is a biography written by the nurse and hotelier, perhaps, Mary Seacole. Mary Seacole basically went to the Crimea, set up what she called the English Hotel, which was only a few miles from the main battle lines in the Crimea. She would walk towards the sound of gunfire. She would perform first aid. She would bring people back to the hotel to be treated. There's something a little bit dodgy about it, because it was kind of a hotel. They did have kind of extra entertainment, drinking and other things, and it wasn't really an official hospital, although she probably saved an awful lot of lives. And in fact, when she got into a little bit of financial trouble after the Crimean War, there were plenty of people who supported her and helped her out because of her work at the English Hotel. She is not to be ignored just because she was informal. She wasn't exactly a friend of Florence Nightingale, though, who was on the Turkish mainland near Constantinople or Istanbul, in a place called Scutari, which is where the main British military hospital was. Actually, there are three very interesting women who were part of the Crimean. There is Mary Seacole, there is Florence Nightingale, and there is also James Barry. Somebody to look up. Fascinating person is James Barry. Born a woman, but became the chief doctor in the British Army, pretty much, at the time of the Crimea. Very fascinating person, that is James Barry. The other book I'd recommend, well, one of the people in the Crimean War, in the siege of Sevastopol, which is the main part of what the Crimean War became, one of the people there was a young gunnery officer called Leo Tolstoy, and he, of course, wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina and all that, but he also wrote a number of Sevastopol diaries, which are very interesting and very much well worth a read, and tell the other side of the conflict, which I think is an important thing to know about. In 1975, Flashman writes The Great Game, which is about what we're going to call it, the Indian Mutiny, the Sepoy Rebellion, the first Indian War of Independence, from 1856 to 1858. Flashman gets involved. He disguises himself he manages to disguise himself as a Pathan. We get a lot of Flashman rushing around, getting ill at convenient times, so he's not part of all the deaths and the massacres. But although this is somewhere where he gains his Victoria Cross. The book I'd recommend here is The Last Mughal by William Dalrymple, published in 2005. Basically, when it comes to Indian history, it does seem to be, if in doubt, go with whatever William Dalrymple says about it. He's a very good historian. He's not doing it from sort of, the British were splendid point of view. In fact, very much far from that. This is a time, the Indian Mutiny is a time when the East India Company basically finally collapsed. The last Mughal emperor, who had been a puppet king up until then, he completely falls from power. And we see finally the British Empire actually starts to take a proper hand in India, for good and ill. The next book is Flashman's Lady, published in 1977. This deals with the years 1842 through to 1845, and in it, Flashman's wife is kidnapped. She's shipped off to the Far East. He has to follow her. He ends up meeting a man called James Brooke, who becomes the first Raja of Sarawak, which is a very bizarre episode in the British Empire, very well worth reading about. He also then travels to Madagascar, where he meets Queen Ranavalona, and that is a fascinating piece of history as well. This Queen of Madagascar, who was very, very fierce and has an extremely bad reputation. Of course, Flashman, being Flashman, with his wonderful whiskers, he manages to charm her. The books to recommend here are Nicholas Montserrat's The White Raja, which tells a story close to that of James Brooke, the Raja of Sarawak. And then also there is The Fugitives, or The Tyrant Queen of Madagascar by R.M. Ballantyne. Probably not a very accurate version of Rana Valona's life, but she is the queen in this, and it's probably very Victorian and very unpleasant towards her. It's by R.M. Ballantyne, who wrote The Coral Sea, and it's probably one of these high Victorian nonsenses. The next book is Flashman and the Redskins from 1982. I don't think you'd be able to call it that these days. It picks up from the end of Flash of Freedom, where in 1848, where Flashman is basically in trouble and of course gets out of it his usual way, then becomes a scout and a train leader for a group of people heading across to California because of the California gold rush. These are minor 49ers. We then jump forward later to 1875, 1876, where Flashman finds himself accompanying the 7th Cavalry to the area around a river called Little Bighorn. And of course, he takes part in Custer's Last Stand. The two books I'd recommend for this are Thomas Berger's Little Big Man, which is a similar book to Flashman in many ways, where we have a character, the Little Big Man of the title, who takes part in a lot of American history, including meeting Wild Bill Hickok and also taking part in Custer's Last Stand. Another book to recommend is Crazy Horse and Custer by Stephen E. Ambrose. He's the man behind the book The Band of Brothers. And that book, because Crazy Horse makes a brief appearance in Flashman and the Redskins, so it's worth looking into that fascinating man as well. The next book to talk about is Flashman and the Dragon. This is set in China in 1860 and is about one of the many opium wars, which do not exactly show Britain in bathed in glory. One of the characters is Lord Elgin's son. Yeah, you know the Lord Elgin I'm talking about, perhaps. Well, he was at the head of an army marching towards Peking, now Beijing, and on the way they destroyed and looted the old summer palace. Yeah, which was quite a feat of destruction. It's not a good hereditary record, perhaps. A couple of books to recommend here are about one of the characters in this book, who is the Dowager Empress Cixi. One book called The Dowager Empress Cixi by Yung Chang. It's a bit of a hagiography about her, but still very much worth reading. Yung Chang is a very interesting writer, and a lot of her books are very well worth reading. Another book worth reading is Imperial Woman by Pearl S. Buck. Pearl S. Buck is a fascinating character. Her best-known book is The Good Earth. I think it's one of the ones that won her all sorts of prizes. She eventually won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I think she may have been one of the first women, certainly one of the first American women, to win the prize. And she had a fascinating life. She wrote an awful lot about China. The next book is Flashman and the Mountain of Light, published in 1845-1846. This is about the Second Anglo-Sikh War, where basically the British take over the Punjab and gain the Koh-i-Noor diamond. And it has an awful lot about the gaining of the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Although the handover of the Koh-i-Noor diamond was a condition of the treaty that ended the Second Anglo-Sikh War, it was very much a victor's treaty, and we can debate whether or not the Koh-i-Noor should have been handed over or not. But it does feature quite a lot in the story, especially about who is wearing it and where she's wearing it and where Flashman is and how he's feeling about that. The story of the Koh-i-Noor diamond is told in Koh-i-Noor, The History of the World's Most Infamous Diamond, published in 2016 by William Dalrymple and Anita Anand. I think it's probably going to be a pretty good history book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading that at some point. And of course, if we're talking about big diamonds that show up from India mysteriously and really shouldn't be there, and the Indians want to take them back, then probably the best book to read about that is The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, where that is a very major part, and it was based on what Wilkie Collins thought about the acquisition of the Koh-i-Noor diamond. In 1994, George MacDonald Fraser writes Flashman and the Angel of the Lord. This is set in 1858 and 1859. It is further adventures of Flashman in the United States of America, where he gets embroiled with a certain John Brown and his attack on Harper's Ferry. Books to recommend here are The Good Lord Bird by James McBride and James Brown, Abolitionist by David S. Reynolds. In 1999, George MacDonald Fraser published Flashman and the Tiger. I actually went to a signing of this and have a signed copy of the book. And I also learnt something rather important about the great unwritten Flashman book, which we'll get to later. Flashman and the Tiger is a novella which goes around the Battle of Rorke's Drift, and also has elements of a Sherlock Holmes story, where we meet a character from a book called a Sherlock Holmes story called The Empty Room, which is the first story in the return of Sherlock Holmes. It also has two shorter stories. One is a kind of callback to Royal Flash, where we once again meet Flashman, and we meet the son of one of the antagonists in Royal Flash. We then another story is called The Subtleties of Baccarat, which is all about Bertie, the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, getting involved in a Baccarat scandal, which he did in I think the 1870s. I'm going to recommend a series of books here. One is Bertie and the Tin Man by Peter Lovesey. This is one of his Bertie, Prince of Wales detective novels, where Bertie solves crimes, often crimes that he's somewhat involved in. The next book to recommend, of course, is The Return of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle, because this has the story of the empty room, where we meet one of the characters we meet in more detail in Flashman and the Tiger. Since Flashman and the Tiger takes place partially during the Zulu War and at Rorke's Drift, where Flashman turns up once again, I also have to recommend Zulu Rising by Ian Knight. One of the things that has fascinated many people about the Flashman stories are the hints he drops about what Flashman did during the American Civil War. In this, apparently, he served as aide-de-camp to both Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, and he also was a tactical military advisor to both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy. It would be difficult to imagine exactly how he did it. And while I was in the queue, George MacDonald Fraser said to somebody early on, well, that he'd thought he'd covered enough of it. And really, that's probably true. I think that there is immense problems with him trying to cover that particular part of American history. It is very, very well documented. You know from almost hour to hour what all those main people were doing, and it would be very difficult for him to fit Flashman into those stories. And I think it was just too much of a job for him to try to do, even with George MacDonald Fraser's skill at putting Flashman into historical events. I think it was just too far, so he suggests it rather than having to write it. So, which is probably explains why he told the person in front of me in the queue that he'd probably written enough about Flashman and the American Civil War, but it is the great untold story, and I'd love it to be told, but I'd only ever want it to be told by George MacDonald Fraser and really nobody else. The last Flashman book is Flashman and the March from 2005. This involves a rather odd piece of history where Britain sent an expeditionary force against Abyssinia, and while they didn't invade and take over the country, they did sort of affect who was running the country. They put in a client king and put somebody else into exile for the rest of their life, which is, fairly typical of colonialism at the time. It's not the best of the Flashman books. It's rather something of a disappointment as the last entry in the Flashman series, really, but well worth reading. The books to read here are The Prince and the Plunder by Robert Hevers. This is about the young man who should have been perhaps king of Abyssinia, and the British put in his uncle instead and took him into exile in Britain, where he lived a fairly unhappy life. And the other book is The Shadow King by Manzo Mengistu. This isn't about that particular British expedition. This is about the Italian campaign in Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, as Ethiopia was once called, and this is about people pretending to be the Emperor Haile Selassie in order to hoodwink the Italian invaders. And it's a very, very fascinating book. Those are some long choices for Flashman alternatives. I would recommend reading Flashman books. Like I said, trigger warnings for colonialism and sexual politics, but I do think they're well worth reading. But if you don't feel like reading them, you can always do Flashman alternatives.